Hi and welcome to Conversations with Robyn. On today's program, we have a man by the name of Sacha Molitorisz. And Sacha, amongst many things, is a journalist with the Sunday Herald and is also an author with his first book, From Here to Paternity. Sacha, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Hi, Robyn. Thanks.
What's it like being a new author?
Well, as we were talking about, being a new author and being a new dad, there's a little bit of a similarity there. It's great. This is my first book. I've been writing for a long time. I've always wanted to write. I studied English literature and law, so I've always been into words and various weird combinations of words. And I've always been into humour, and that's something I hope that comes out in the book. So this is a combination of that, and I guess the most important thing that's happened in my life, well, probably ever, I'd say, since the day I was born. You know, having a baby.
And what's her name?
Edie.
And how old's Edie now?
Edie turned 2, 10 days ago. So this book charts from roughly about conception, it talks a little bit before that as well, but about conception to just after her first birthday. Okay. So that fraught 2-year period.
And when was this published? Because we're now in September 2007. So when was the book published?
The book was published right at the end of July, start of August this year. So it's just come out. It's been out for about a month and a half. It was conceived, that word just seems to roll off the tongue when we're talking about this subject. It was conceived soon after Edie was conceived. Joe and I, my wife and I, were living overseas in Paris during most of 2004, and it was 2 days before we came home that we realised Jo was pregnant, and that was it was a shock, of course. It was really big news. And then we came back to Australia, and it was about a month or two after that I thought, look, I've been a journalist for let's say 13 years or so. I love writing. I've always wanted to write a book. I don't know what's going to happen, but I know it's going to be an amazing little trip. I know that this is going to be really life-changing, and I want to write about it. And the initial idea was just to write something funny, something light-hearted, not really incredibly substantial. And then that changed over time.
And it is. It's a very funny read.
Thank you.
You've got some great research notes in there also. How did you research this subject?
Well, that's how the book changed, actually, from the initial inception being something humorous and light. I started then having a little bit of a look around in bookshops to see what sort of books there were. Most of the books by dads, for dads, were like that, pretty flippant, not that substantial. And I realised as my wife's pregnancy wore on that I was having some unexpected emotions. I was much more anxious than I expected, and the whole experience, just thinking about this impending change, was a lot more profound, and that was before the baby even came along. So as that happened and I started realising there wasn't that much profound in the way of books that was out there.
For dads.
Yeah. I thought, look, I'll try to do the topic a bit more justice, and rather than just put my story down on paper and have a few laughs, hopefully, start researching, reading up, looking into a few journals on certain topics, and just sort of making the book a balance of memoir and humour, and on the other hand, some more substantial research into fatherhood in other cultures, fatherhood down the decades, how it's changed in Australia over the decades, fatherhood in the animal kingdom, those sorts of things. I found out things about, for instance, postnatal depression in men, something that I had no idea existed.
And also things, we'll get into dads feeling jealous of their babies.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's a reality, and I can't even imagine how some men must give themselves a tough time over that.
Absolutely. Look, one of the things that I kept reading about and then discovered for myself is that with parenthood, and maybe even more so with motherhood, there comes a real sense of guilt that you're not doing enough for your child, that you're doing things the wrong way, because especially with a first-time baby, you just don't really know what you're doing. You're just making it up as you go along. So, and the jealousy is a big one. That was a real surprise for me, just to read about it at first a little bit and then to experience it. Because to sum that up, in a nutshell, a lot of these things, you can't really encapsulate in a couple of easy sentences, because they're emotions that sort of pop up a little bit and then they go away and come back. It's such an emotionally complex time, the pregnancy, and then especially after the child is born. But with the jealousy, you go to the hospital, you and your partner, and there are two of you, and you come home and there are three of you. So everything changes. The dynamic between you and your partner is very different, and it really does feel for the man a lot of the time. Certainly in my experience, there were times after Edie was born that I felt like the third wheel. I felt like the least important person in that relationship. I'd go off to work, I'd earn the money, I'd support the family, but the baby was the most important, the most dependent, the most helpless. And Mum needed, Jo, my wife, needed a lot of support as well, and she was doing this important job and breastfeeding, and as a dad you just kind of feel almost irrelevant, and certainly not as loved and important as you were.
Well, I remember also one of your male friends said to you that it's not actually real until the baby comes into the world.
Yeah.
So how was that for you?
Oh, very much so, yeah. A number of people said that to me. And it was, again, there are so many emotions and aspects to that question. But during the pregnancy, I found it was actually a much more intense time than I expected. And I don't think all men feel that. A lot of men don't feel much during the pregnancy. And this particular friend, for him, he didn't feel that much, I think, during the pregnancy. Then when the baby came, all of a sudden it was very real in his arms. And for me, to an extent, that's right. It was only real then because only then did I really know what I was dealing with. And in a sense, I don't want to harp on about the negatives because it's such a challenging time becoming a dad, let alone becoming a mum. But there are all these tiny joys that sort of pop up every now and again. And as I'm finding more and more so as your little one gets older and the bond between you and your little one continues to grow. I mean, the large part of my inspiration for writing the book became just to talk about and to get people to talk about fatherhood, because I don't think it's talked about all that much. I mean, the stereotype is that blokes don't talk about their emotions all that much, and there is truth to it. I don't talk about my emotions as easily as my wife does. So hopefully, with the book, I'm encouraging blokes to talk about their emotions, blokes and women to talk about fatherhood, and just to examine fatherhood, because I think the role of fatherhood is still really being worked out. We're still working out what it is fathers should do, what they are doing. That's still something that's in flux. Our society's not, those rules or those parameters for dads aren't really nailed down.
Well, before we go more into the book, what about your personal journey? You were born in Germany?
I was.
Okay. How many siblings?
I've got none. I'm an only child.
Okay.
And I just assumed that I wouldn't really have children until about my late 20s when that changed. But yeah, I was born in Germany. My family came to Australia when I was 4 years old in 1973. As I like to say, we came to Australia the same year that the Opera House was unveiled. Two enormous, momentous occasions for Sydney they were.
Sacha in the Opera House.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And I've lived in Sydney ever since. This has been my hometown, so I'm much more Australian than German, but I still feel those German roots. And we just actually, about 2 months ago, went back to Munich, which is the town where I was born, and saw my grandmother, so Edie's great-grandmother. Okay. And that was really very a special time in a way that I couldn't have predicted, because Edie was not yet 2, and you don't know how she's going to take to someone who's so much older than her. She's never really been around someone anywhere near that age before, and they don't speak the same language. My grandma speaks German and no English, so they didn't speak the same language. Edie's just learning to speak, and yet she's quite a good communicator when she wants something. And they had a really great bond, which surprised me, which was great.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Listen, we'll take a break and we'll come back and find out more about Sacha's journey and about his book, From Here to Paternity. Stay with us. And we're having a conversation with Sacha Molitorisz about his new book, From Here to Paternity. In your journey as a dad, you mentioned in our earlier segment that you and your wife were living in Paris. And I know that you were planning to have a baby, you just weren't planning to conceive then. How was that? Because that kind of was a bit fast tracking for you.
A little bit. I guess the way that I put it is we were we'd thought about beginning to contemplate maybe potentially looking to have a baby. You know, there's all this kind of, yeah, we're about ready to begin. And we had this rough plan of getting healthy, as a lot of people do, because we've been living in Paris for about 6 or 7 months at the time, and it was a sabbatical from work for both of us. So we've been drinking too much and eating lots of rich, great food. And the plan was not to do anything radical. I know I've heard of people who do the whole overhaul, you know, the complete detox. It wasn't anything that serious, but just to cut down on the drinking a bit. And at the time, we actually weren't being intimate, if I can put it that way, all that often, because we had a small flat in Paris we were living in, and we had so many visitors. If you ever want to see more of your family and friends move to Paris, they'll come and visit you. And so we had this small window where we could just enjoy each other's company between 2 sets of visitors. And I thought that at that particular time, there wasn't a chance of Jo becoming pregnant just because of her cycles. But nature had other ideas. We obviously didn't calculate very well or didn't know how to use contraception properly, because Edie's the result.
Snuck in.
Yeah.
Well, also you use that figure that only about 50% of conceptions go to full term. Right.
Yeah. I can't remember that figure myself, but there are all sorts of figures in there that are really fascinating, and that is one of them. I'll take my word for it.
Check the book out later.
Yeah, I'll have to read it.
Okay, so the journey through to, because Jo also had a gallbladder?
Gallstone, yeah.
Gallstone. What happened there?
There is no such thing as an ordinary pregnancy, is a saying that you hear a lot. And as the more I learn about it, the more I realise I don't know about pregnancy and fatherhood, and that so many unexpected twists and turns happen along the way. And one for us was that it must have been a few months into the pregnancy the first time Jo just felt these incredible pains. And she's very stoic and doesn't really let on when she's in a bit of pain. So she just put it down to a bit of indigestion, which she's never had before, and which can happen during pregnancy as well. And these bouts got worse, and they would go all night, and she was in real pain, I could tell. And they started to become more frequent. And eventually, after a few months, she was about 6 months pregnant, I think, when we finally went to hospital, and she stayed in all day. Having all these tests done, and they established that it was gallstones. And that is quite a common side effect of pregnancy.
Is it really?
It is, because a woman's biochemistry just changes enormously during pregnancy. And that's one of the unfortunate side effects, yeah.
Because also you were saying in the book that when a woman, as the pregnancy develops, all the different organs kind of shift to make room for the baby. Is that why the gallstone thing happens?
Not so much because of the shifting organs, but I mean, what a woman's body does during pregnancy is just absolutely astounding. And this is largely a book about fatherhood, of course, but and fatherhood is this incredible transition that you make. But really, compared to what a woman makes as she becomes a mother, it's easy. It's a walk in the park, which is why I think books like this aren't so commonplace, whereas there are thousands of books about the transition to motherhood. A woman, for instance, when she has a baby, when she goes into the labour ward, will generally have about 1.5 times as much blood as she had when she became pregnant. All her organs, as you say, have just shifted in her body. And there are all these details about the physical changes that are just absolutely staggering. And I do touch on them, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, most men wouldn't know about any of this until their wife is pregnant with their child.
Or even when their wife is pregnant, they still wouldn't know. And I wouldn't have known, I wouldn't have found out unless I'd undertaken the book and done all this sort of research. I mean, I wasn't the sort of guy who would go out and buy a book and read all about pregnancy in the lead up to the birth. The stereotype is that that's what women do more than men, and that's certainly true in my relationship. You know, the only way you'd get me to read a book is to get me to write it first.
And done very well. And another area you touch on is that men are so used to being in the driving seat.
Yeah, that's right.
And all of a sudden they've got to go in the passenger seat. How was that for you?
Well, that was a real challenge in a lot of ways. During the pregnancy especially, you're used as a man in a lot of cases to being the doer, to being active, to being in the driver's seat. And then during the pregnancy, it's your wife, your partner, who has this amazing role of growing a human being in her tummy. You know, that's just, to me, such a... It's almost impossible to get my head around how that can be. Yeah. So you're there, and your role is to knit the scarves, to get the thermos of coffee, metaphorically speaking.
Yeah.
You're in the supportive role, and that comes to an absolute head in the labour ward then, where your partner is, depending on how it's going, but your partner is generally in a lot of pain, a lot of discomfort, playing this incredibly crucial role that will affect you for the rest of your lives, and you're just there again, just playing this support role, and that's a real challenge. You want to step in and take some of the pain away and do it yourself. Here, give me that pregnancy, I'll take over, but you can't. That's confronting.
At least for the human species, you can't.
Yeah.
Because we will touch on, like the male seahorse.
Yeah.
It carries a child.
That's right. That's right. One of the things I did, as I mentioned, was to look into fatherhood in the animal kingdom, because it's really interesting to compare different species. I mean, even within mammals, the stereotype is that mammal dads are pretty uninvolved. Mammals, by definition, the mum breastfeeds the young. So that creates a very intimate bond between mother and child, usually quite a dependent child, and the father has often been seen as not being all that relevant. In fact, there have been lots of theorists who say that the dad doesn't need to be there, and it's his biological imperative to go out and impregnate as many women as possible, because that's how he passes on his DNA, his genes. But then there's, I think, from what I can tell, it's the more recent research that's saying, no, it doesn't necessarily have to be like that in mammals, and certainly not in humans. It serves evolution and the species best when dads are more involved and hands-on, because that gives that offspring the best chance of survival. And if the dad isn't there in a supportive role early on in a baby's life, chances of survival aren't so good.
It's interesting, isn't it, getting all those stats? We're going to take another break, and then we'll come back and find out more, because one of the questions that I'd love to ask, according to your research, we're told now it's great for the dad to be in the delivery room. There's many, I guess, answers around that, but also what happens to the couple's intimacy relationship if dad has been there after birth.
That's a very big issue.
Yes, which is when I saw the article and got me to ring you in the first place to say, hey, come on the show, stay with us. Thanks for staying with us. Before the break, Sacha, we're talking about a number of things, but including about, dads are now, say, go into the delivery room, hold your wife's hand. What's firstly your first-hand experience of that, but also what's your research telling you?
Well, there's a whole book to be written in just the dad's experience of the labour ward. That's just such an eventful period, and again, it must be different for every couple or every single mum that goes in there. It's just such a so much happens so quickly. In our case, there was a lot of fear. Edie was 3 weeks overdue, which is very unusual these days, because doctors, the medical people, really like to induce usually about 10 days afterwards. They don't like to let you go that long. And
why did they? Why did they let it go 3 weeks?
Well, I guess ultimately it's not up to them. It's up to, they can't force you to have an induction. And in our case, we just felt everything was fine. We were doing all the tests. We were going to hospital every day or two, and Jo was having the belt put around her waist to measure it's a CTG test, to have the baby's heartbeat measured and to test the amniotic fluid via ultrasound, and everything was fine. And Jo knew also that her mum was very overdue with all her babies, so it seems to run in the family. It's just the way that the science of childbirth has evolved. there's much more of a focus on due dates these days. You know, it's our approach to childbirth, as far as I can tell, like to a lot of things, is a very rational, reason-based, scientific approach rather than more of an intuitive, you know, how's the mum feeling type approach. And you can see why, because the result has been that the child mortality is just, figures of child mortality have plummeted. You know, it's very, not many children and not many mums die in childbirth in Australia anymore. But putting that aside, there are lots of interesting aspects to a father's experience of the delivery ward, and one of them that I read about, which I ended up including in the book, came to me from an article that described a New York psychologist who had described a condition called delivery ward trauma. And this relates to men who see their partners give birth and then have what he called trauma, which means that they can't feel, they stop seeing their wives or partners as sexual beings. After all the blood and the visceral nature of childbirth, they can't anymore see their partners erotically. And to me, I thought this was a classic victim mentality attitude. I just couldn't actually see how this could be true after my own experience of the delivery ward, where it was, you know, terrifying. There were moments of despair, and then there were moments of elation. But at the end of it all, I felt more in love with my wife than I ever have, and it certainly didn't dampen my erotic feelings. It didn't make me stop seeing her as a sexual being. But looking into the whole notion of delivery ward trauma, I found that, there are people out there who claim to be affected by it. So you know, I've got to accept that.
So can you, though, it sounds like, though, you do have an understanding more of that now, how that may be the case.
Yeah. Having
had your experience of the...
Yeah, absolutely. Well, something I do besides the book is I write a blog for the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age websites, and it's called Who's Your Daddy? And it was, in part, I used some of the discussions that arose on the blog, some of the comments, as the basis for a few of the chapters in the book. And the topic of sex after childbirth was one of those topics where there was just such an informed and fascinating discussion on the blog that I ended up using quite a lot of what readers posted in response to the blog.
Okay. Well, let's go back then prior to birth and sex during pregnancy. That's a big one for couples also.
It is, and I think it's a bit of a taboo. There aren't really many taboos in our society anymore, and it's probably a bit strong to say sex during pregnancy is a taboo, but I think it used to be. I mean, for me, one indication of that is that in, I think it was the early 70s, there was a film that had real problems at the Sydney Film Festival, and the censors came in and wanted to cut some scenes, and it was a pregnant woman having sex. They were the scenes that caused tremendous problems. So I think it's still a little bit of a taboo, I guess, if there is such a thing. And I would say that's because we're not used to seeing pregnant women as sexual beings, which ties into the fact of we're not used to seeing women as the sexual, the drivers of sex. We're more used to seeing women as sex objects. Of course, that's a whole another discussion, a pretty big one. But sex during pregnancy, just as with sex after childbirth, the research I did and the comments that I got on the blog just showed to me that there are so many different responses. Men and women during pregnancy, they can have their sex lives remain exactly as it was before. Same after childbirth. You know, sex can go back to being exactly what it was in a matter of a few weeks. But then for a lot of couples, sex life changes dramatically. A lot of women report that during pregnancy they feel much more aroused than ever. The nature of orgasms, for instance, really changes during pregnancy for a lot of women. As I said before, women have a lot more blood in their bodies, and that affects the nature of sex. And for men, a lot of men report no change to their libido or anything like that. But then some do. You know, some become overwhelmed by the anxiety of the fact that they're about to become parents. There's this big change on the way, and feel a serious decrease in libido. And then after childbirth, things vary even more tremendously.
Lack of sleep.
Yeah.
And all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Well, going to now, you know, babies here, and you were talking about some of the research you've done in the animal world and with different cultures. The Aka pygmy males, that was an interesting one. What is it that they do with their babies when mum's not around?
Well, there was a competition run by this UK organisation called Fathers Direct, where they were looking, and it's this group, I think a not-for-profit group that tries to raise the profile of dads, raise awareness of what dads are doing and the importance of the role of dads. And so they had this gentle competition where they were looking around the world to try to see who were the best dads in the world. And this was a few years ago, and they came across the Aka pygmy from Western Africa, and there aren't that many of them in the world, and they put babies to their breast. They don't actually breastfeed, but they find that sometimes the mums are away. I don't know why they're away. I don't know what the labour arrangements are. Maybe, who knows? But so the men often do, if the babies are unsettled, grab them and put them on the breast to soothe them, and apparently it works.
Yeah, and the babies can be there for
a couple of hours, 3 hours, something like that.
And everybody's happy.
Apparently.
And have you done that with yours?
I can't say I've tried that. I would find that a little bit confronting. Call me old-fashioned.
But it's interesting, isn't it? You know, when we look at Indigenous cultures, so much of what they did is so normal, natural, harmonious, and yet in our culture, Western culture, we're so cut off from so much of who we are.
Well, that's very true. I think that point comes up at various points of the book because I think that's true. We're very, as I was mentioning before, I think we are quite out of touch with our bodies and intuition, and the whole childbirth really brings that into relief in a lot of ways. It's been very medicalised and regimented, and once you announce your pregnancy and go to the hospital and register and put your name down for the room and all the stuff that you've got to do, you're kind of on this treadmill where you've got to go for this test at these weeks and this test here, and it's true we don't listen to our bodies all that often, and maybe a lot more men would be putting babies to their breast if we did listen.
If we did. It's very clinical.
Yeah.
We'll take another break and come back for another part of our conversation with Sacha. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us. Sacha, before the break, we're talking about the Aka male pygmies and putting the baby to their nipple when mum was not around. What other animals in the dad world out there with babies take on a more nurturing role?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the seahorses before. It's the males that get pregnant and then have, I think it's somewhere around a dozen foals. And
what do they call them?
I think they're called foals.
Okay.
Just, this research I did about a year ago now, so you're testing my memory, and my memory's not great. I'm a father. And they raise them, spend the first while raising them. There are birds. Birds are often, the men are often very clucky too. And sometimes men, the dads, pair up with other men to raise the young.
Are you talking about the penguins,
of course, they're very, the penguins, the emperor penguins from Antarctica, they've been in the, talked about a bit lately. There was the March of the Penguins, of course, and the males there are incredibly clucky and do a lot of the work where they make their big trek across the ice and incubate the eggs on their feet. For several months, it turns into, as the mums take off to the sea to fish and eat, and they need to get that strength from the food so that they can then breastfeed. I think I've got that right, when they get back and raise the little ones.
Because the dads put their belly over the...
That's right.
Because the happy feet, that...
Exactly, happy feet's another. Yeah, the emperor penguins have been flavour of the month.
They have indeed.
Yeah, down at my local restaurant anyway. No, I'm sorry.
Avoid that one.
No, we'll cut that out later in the editing room.
So what other animals that the males take on a fairly supportive role?
Yeah, well, look, they're the ones that pop to mind. Let's see.
You've got the seahorses,
Yep.
the acapygmies, the penguins. I know there's a lot of other fish critters.
Yeah, the fish are good too. And there are, at the other end of the spectrum, some of the say elephants. They're not so considered great dads. They're not going to win any great dad awards. In a lot of cases, the males can be ostracised from the herd when they become dads, and there's been known to be some infanticide with elephants. And look, that's not really my area of expertise, and in the book, that forms a small part, and it's really just to put into perspective some of the I guess my own experiences, and it is largely about humans and how we raise babies. I'm certainly no expert on the animal kingdom.
It's quite interesting, isn't it?
It's very interesting.
So back to delivery room. Are you pleased you actually went into the delivery room with Joe?
Yeah, very much so.
Would you recommend it?
I would. I'd recommend it very highly. I guess, the fact that delivery ward trauma seems to exist would say to me that it's probably good to be aware that this could happen. On the one hand, I'm tempted to say to people who are about to become dads, think about that. On the other hand, I'd be tempted to say, don't even mention it to them. When you're about to become a dad, you've got things to worry about anyway. And I think sometimes you can build up fears by anticipating them. You can create fears almost. For me, being in the delivery room was an overwhelmingly positive experience. In retrospect, largely. At the time, it was quite traumatic, just because things weren't going to plan. As I started to say before, we were induced, and then Edie just didn't want to come. She wasn't ready. She probably would have stayed in for another week, I think. So the drugs that we used in induction, we ramped up. The hospital ramped up and more, so the pain became more and more unbearable, which led to other forms of intervention. And this is quite a common story, apparently. And we were looking like Joe was going to need an emergency cesarean, and so that whole process, from my perspective, where I can't do anything, I'm just sort of hand holding and providing reassurance, was terribly confronting. But then in the end, all went very well. Edie was born without an emergency cesarean, and everyone was healthy and well. And it was this overwhelmingly positive experience. This something that was very traumatic and difficult that had this euphoric ending. All's well that ends well. It's this marvellous occasion, and it really did. It made me love my wife more than I ever have. It's hard to fathom how a person can go through this for you, the collective you, for the family that you're starting to build.
So, in hindsight, what do you wish, there may have been nothing, that you did know now that you've been through the journey? What do you wish that you had have known beforehand that you then discovered for yourself? Or
that's a very big question. But we live in an age where there's so much information and you learn so much. And sometimes that's great. Knowledge is power, as a lot of people say, but other times we know too much, and we know too much about details. I would say I wish more people had took me aside and said, look, don't worry, it'll be fine. But having said that, if they'd told me that, I probably wouldn't have believed them, because you don't know what's coming. I'd like people to say, look, it's going to be hard, but you'll manage, you'll make mistakes. Everyone does. And the little critters are tougher than you think. They seem completely defenceless. And I think it's in evolution's and nature's interest to make parents think that their young are so incredibly precious that they could just die if you breathe on them incorrectly. But really, it's also in nature's interest to make them quite resilient. And some of the midwives say you can drop them and they'll bounce. But you will make mistakes as a parent. You will. And hopefully you'll get better if you have more kids or just over time.
Back to actually talking more about the effect that this book has had on couples. You were sharing about a letter that you received a few weeks after it had been published. What was that?
Yeah, that's right. Well, an extract from the book was published in the Sun Herald in Sunday Life. I do most of my work for the Sydney Morning Herald, but occasionally for the Sun Herald as well. And this extract was about sex after childbirth. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the content of that chapter was comments from people on the blog. And so it ended up going off on all sorts of tangents and to me really providing a fairly broad examination of that topic. And I guess if I don't know if there was a message to it, but maybe one of the things that people took from it was that a wide variety of things can happen to a couple's sex life. I feel like our lives have fallen apart a little bit. You know, is this normal? And hopefully by writing that chapter and by having that extract printed, it made people feel that a little bit more. And a few weeks after the extract was published in the magazine, there was a letter that said, "Look, thank you for this article. You're saving our marriage." You know, and that just made me feel fantastic. Because it just made this woman who wrote in, and made her feel as if, look, all the stuff that's happening to us, our sex life has gone through some difficulties since our babies arrived, but we're now talking about it a bit more, in part thanks to that article, because we realise that a lot of people have differing and difficult experiences of sex after childbirth.
Okay, we'll take another break and come back for the last part of our conversation with Sacha and explore this a little bit more, and also that jealousy thing that dads may experience. Stay with us. Thanks for coming back with the last part of our conversation with Sacha. And Sacha, during that break, we're just having a chat with the crew. And what was some of the feedback you were hearing from the guys?
Well, just talking about delivery ward trauma, where men who go into the labour ward and see their child born and then come out and have trouble seeing their wives in a sexual way. And it sounds like that is definitely occurring. Yeah.
And I wonder how much of this isn't actually spoken about. And I wonder also, you know, we wanted to get onto the subject about dads feeling a bit of jealousy. So if they've got a bit of a trauma about seeing their wife give birth, then they're ignored, and then the jealousy comes up. Can you just share more around for couples to start talking?
I think that's crucial, you know. To communicate is really, really important, and I would say every one of us has difficulties in communicating it sometimes. You know, and I know that my partner, my wife and I, you know, we sometimes you let little things sort of build up, little frustrations, and childbirth can really bring that out, because after a child is born, you become tired, you become harried, you don't really know what you're doing, you're sort of floundering for a little while. Well, certainly that's how I felt, and I think it's how many new parents do. And there's the readjustment of the relationship where there were two of you, now there's a baby. So it's a matter of the mum and the dad just working out where they stand again in relation to each other, in relation to this new being. Your roles within the family have changed because your family's changed. There are three of you where there were two. And
so it's redefining the roles and actually having a conversation around it.
And you don't, I mean, you know this in a philosophical, theoretical way before. I mean, obviously you're going to come home from hospital with three of you, but the reality of that you can't really comprehend, I think. You know, I certainly couldn't. And so you come home, and over time, as your roles are readjusting, well, for me, I did find there were times when I started to feel jealous. I guess that's the only word I can use. As much as I loved Edie, you know, every minute, you know, in every way, and wouldn't have changed a thing at any time, despite the 4 a.m. pacing the hallway, trying to get her to stop crying, and despite these pangs of jealousy, whatever it may be. But yeah, there were definitely moments where I mourned the fact that the relationship I had with my wife was not what we had anymore. You know, and as I was saying, we had a sabbatical overseas in France before we came back to Australia, and Jo was pregnant, and then we had Edie. So there was that real stark contrast of this time overseas where it was just the two of us. We weren't working. We were having really a charmed life for a few months, and then the reality of going back to work, having a baby, and then finding, you don't have that same. Your wife might not have the same time that she had. Well, she won't as she had for you. You don't have the same time for her because a lot of your energies are now going to taking care of this newborn, who is the centre of your life, and you don't really know what you're doing, so you're sort of struggling. And yeah, it's a big readjustment.
Okay, well, let's ask you about your personal experience of jealousy. What were you feeling? What were you thinking? Let's go into that a bit, because, if there's a lot of men out there feeling this, then it's probably going to help them to know how to handle it and save marriages.
Yeah, I guess, putting a word like jealousy on it is kind of in some ways almost oversimplifying it, because there are so many things going on in your head. You're tired for a start, so you become a bit more irrational. You're in love with this new being, hopefully. Different men and women have different bonding experiences with their kids. And just to go into mine there, I guess I had a tremendous bonding moment in the labour ward, and that was lovely. But I don't think have the same outpouring of love as Joe had. And when Edie was put on her chest, and they had an instant, lightning bolt bond. Whereas I had that to a certain degree, but mine was more, I guess, of a traditional bloke's way, where it grew more over time. It was a bond that sort of strengthened as Edie grew up, and I really felt that. Maybe when around about the time she turned 1, it suddenly turned a corner, and I was like, I'm really loving being a dad. It feels much more comfortable now. I feel like I've kind of made it here. I'm okay. But yeah, wrapped up in that and more was this, which a feeling I can only describe as jealousy, where it's that Edie is getting this attention that should rightfully be mine. She should have. I should be getting more of my wife's love and attention, nurturing and all that sort of stuff. At one point, it did seem like that bond between Joe and Edie is almost, you could describe as erotic, because it's so physical and so intense. And so you just feel a bit left out.
Okay, so then how did you handle those moments when you had those feelings and those thoughts? What did you do?
Well, in my case, it was never so serious. This is just something that is part of the rich tapestry of becoming a dad, I guess, and you have your ups and downs, and they're exacerbated by the fact that you're tired and you're feeling out of your depth at times. And I was lucky enough that that things never really got very bad for a long time, or they were just little troughs where for half a day I'd feel a little bit, sad, or I never got to the point where I burst into tears or anything like that. But I remember an afternoon where I felt a bit teary, or so it's nothing dramatic. They're just kind of the highs and lows, and there were so many times where I just felt ecstatic and happy. Ultimately, what I hope comes out in the book is that my experience of becoming a dad has just been absolutely overwhelmingly positive, extremely challenging at times, but I wouldn't change a thing. And part of it is, I think, that my relationship with my wife has become richer and more layered, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty clear from reading the book, and also hearing your thoughts today. I guess though, part of me, after hearing what 2 of our male crew said, and some of your experiences, part of me then wants to sort of follow this track down here, because we're talking at one stage about this is a book that could save marriages.
Oh, well, that would be great. And look, as I mentioned also, it's I just want the role of fatherhood. That would be a great aim for me, a great achievement, if fatherhood is discussed a little bit more and we start thinking about what it is fathers do and should be doing. And if it saves marriages, that would be absolutely fantastic, of course. But one of the particular conditions that I hope people become aware of when they read the book, or out of discussions that arise from the book, is postnatal depression in men, which a lot of people don't know about. I had no idea existed before I started researching the book. And apparently it afflicts about 4% of dads, which is quite a significant number. Postnatal depression for women is tremendously significant. Apparently it's about 15% of mums who are affected. So, that's the big picture. That's a serious statistic. but it does also exist for men. And often it happens in tandem, where one partner is depressed. There's often a kind of contagion there where that partner is not coping, therefore it's so much harder for the other partner, and then the other partner can get depressed as well. And I think just the fact that people know about the fact that postnatal depression can exist in men would make it more likely for someone, a dad who isn't coping, to talk about it. And just by talking about it, that makes it more likely that the problem can be addressed and treated, because it's something that's treatable.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and how important is intimacy for a couple? Which is probably like a stupid question on one level, but it seems also that if a new dad is feeling a little jealous and ignored and may have some postnatal depression happening, surely if they're able to talk about it and the sooner they can get back to that intimacy, that's got to stop a whole bunch of problems from enlarging down the track. Can you just share on that one?
It does. Well, look, the male tendency is often, I do this all the time, that when you're confronted and you're feeling like you're not getting what you would like to be getting and think you deserve, whatever aspect of your relationship that is, then you can get a bit resentful and retreat into yourself, and that can be a bit of a trap, because then you become less communicative, and things can get a bit more difficult.
They keep escalating.
Yeah, they just and look, that's not just a bloke thing. That can happen on both sides.
Sure.
Where you think that the other partner isn't pulling their weight. And this is something else that I talk about, because you asked me before, what would I say to people about to become dads? Be aware that it can be very challenging, but I would say, look, the biggest thing you can do, in my experience and talking to people, to give yourself the best chance of having a good experience, is just to muck in as much as you can. Don't get resentful and withdraw from the relationship and get a little bit bitter or anything like that. Get involved, get your hands dirty, That's with changing the nappies and doing all the baby rearing tasks, but also on the other hand, the housework. There are, I think, the statistics bear out that men generally are mucking in a lot more than they used to. They're much more hands-on with raising kids, and they get more involved with housework too. But it's still it's still very unequal. Women still do the lion's share of the child raising for, in some cases, obvious reasons, early on with the breastfeeding, etc. But also with the housework. I think there are men, and this is the traditional way, a lot of men who go to work. They're the go-to-work dads, and it's the stay-at-home mum. There are still, lots of households like that. Our household was like that. I was lucky enough that I could do a lot of my work at home, but it still kind of had that division early on. And I think that in some cases, those men can think, look, I'm going to work, I'm earning the money, I'm supporting this family. I have the right to come home and just watch telly and relax at night because I'm stressed from my day. But the reality is, when you have a new baby, that's not how it should be, because what that means then is that the mum who's been working all day too, just doing a different sort of work, keeping the house in order.
Not valued, perhaps.
Not valued as much, not raising money, raising a child. And having tried both, I've taken a bit of paternity leave and been the primary caregiver for a period of Edie. I know which one's easier. Looking after the baby and keeping the house in order is much more of a challenge than working full-time at the Sydney Morning Herald.
And doing the social bit, because that's what we do when we go to work. We're also socialising.
That's right. It's a real outlet. And I think, there are plenty of dads, for understandable reasons, who use their work as an escape and then work longer hours because it's more fun and easier to be at work than it is to be at home. So I think, look, my big overriding piece of advice, and it's not an advice book, but I guess from my experience, what I would say is get in there and muck in as a new dad, and that, to me, will give you the best chance of having your relationship be well, of having your not having intimacy issues, not having jealousy issues, all these sorts of things. I think you have the best chance of avoiding those sorts of things if, as a dad, you really get busy.
Well, we're just about finished, but I do know some of the articles and research I've read over the years that women find it totally romantic when their husbands do things like bring the clothes off the line, wash up, and all of a sudden they feel so supported, they open up their hearts, and it actually brings in intimacy. So-
vacuuming becomes foreplay.
Yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Sasha, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thanks for having me, Robyn.
It's certainly a very interesting book. It's got lots of research figures. It's also got some really funny articles and also some very sensitive information in there about all the joys and some of the challenge of being a dad.